Welcome to this online lecture for Western Civ 2. Today we are working on a lecture titled The Economics of European Expansion. What this is really about is an attempt to understand what happens to Western civilization when it is brought into contact with the rest of the world, and also what happens to the rest of the world when it comes into contact with Western civilization. As always, there are some key terms that you need to understand if you're going to once you get through this lecture, and also some questions you should be able to answer at the end as well. So let's get to it. To understand the material in this lecture, we need to begin with this graph. If you look at it carefully, it shows a sharp increase in Europe's population that began sometime around 1500. Why did this occur? Well, one reason is that people simply stopped dying. After 1500, there were fewer epidemic diseases that took the lives of tens of millions of Europeans. Remember, we've talked about this in Western Civ 1, actually, that diseases like the Black Death killed 1/3 of the population of Europe in the 1300s. Well, epidemics like this simply stop occurring in Western civilization, and this will have an impact on Europe's population. Now, another explanation is increased food production. New techniques will be developed and new lands opened up to farming. The result will be more food, and more food means more people. But more food can create a problem, and that is overpopulation. This problem is going to have a major impact on the rest of the world over the coming centuries. One solution to the overpopulation problem was colonization. The drive for colonization was driven by a number of factors, including population growth. The colonies proved to be a good safety valve for the growing number of hungry, poor, and unemployed men and women in Europe. These efforts will spur on a transformation of the global economy. In some ways, we are still dealing with that transformation today. Now, don't get the idea that there was only one nation that was leading the colonization of the Americas or the rest of the world. Instead, really, many of the great powers of Western civilization, including France, England, the Netherlands, Spain, and Portugal, were all involved in planting colonies across the Atlantic and in either North or South America. Now, to truly understand the impact of colonization on the peoples of North and South America, we need to begin with this man, Christopher Columbus. Columbus, as you probably know, at least I hope you know, landed in the Americas for the first time in 1492. Now, Columbus did not know he had discovered a new world. He thought he had landed somewhere off the coast of Asia. Nevertheless, despite that mistake, Columbus's landing in the Western Hemisphere will result in something that has become known as the Columbian Exchange. The Columbian Exchange is going to be one of the most important events of the past 600 or 700 years. In fact, some scholars will say it's one of the most important events of the last several million years. To understand why, we need to understand what the Columbian Exchange was all about. This graphic explains the Columbian Exchange. Take chocolate, for example. Chocolate is a native plant to the Americas, but it was unknown in Europe. European exploration and colonization will change that. Now, the same goes for plants like peppers, tomatoes, avocado, potatoes, and corn, just to name a few. On the other side, bananas, pigs, horses, honeybees were all plants and animals known to the Old World, to either Africa, Europe, or Asia. These plants and these animals will be introduced to the Americas from Europe. This is what becomes known as the Columbian Exchange, because after Columbus arrives in 1492, Europe will become aware of these New World plants and animals, and the Americas will become aware of the Old World plants and animals. Hence, a Columbian Exchange. This term Columbian Exchange actually comes from the historian Alfred Crosby. If you want an official definition of the Columbian Exchange, here is one. Quote, the interchange of plants, animals, and diseases between the Old World and the Americas following Columbus's arrival in the Caribbean in 1492, end quote. This was an important event, as this quote from Charles C. Mann explains. He calls this, quote, the most important biological event since the extinction of the dinosaurs. Think about it. I mean, the reason why is simply because, we have the biological unification of the planet. That's an incredible event. But the Columbian Exchange was about more than simply chocolate and horses, however. The diseases above were unknown in the Americas before the arrival of the Europeans. That meant that Indian peoples had no immunity to them. So what impact did that have on native populations? This was the most immediate impact of these so-called virgin soil epidemics. Up to 90% of all native peoples died from diseases brought to the Americas by Europeans. Let me say that again. Up to 90%, 9 out of 10 native peoples died from smallpox, measles, influenza, bubonic plague, cholera, and other diseases that had been unknown in the New World before the arrival of the Europeans. This is perhaps the most significant impact of the Columbian Exchange. But these diseases had another impact on those who survived them. Because native populations died at a far higher rate than Europeans, virgin soil epidemics led many native peoples to doubt their culture, their gods, their spirituality, their very way of seeing the world. Many converted to Christianity simply because they believed it would stop the diseases. Others became disillusioned and really didn't know where to turn following the arrival of these diseases. Another impact of European colonization involved trade. As European colonies became established in the Americas, the New World was integrated into a system of global trade. This became known as the triangular trade. The colonies were intended to generate wealth for the mother country. Now, an active trade developed between Europe, Africa, and the Americas. This became known as the triangular trade. There are 3 legs in this triangle: Africa, Europe, and the Americas. So make sure you understand where that triangle comes from. This is how it worked. The Americas produced raw materials that were shipped to Europe, where they were processed and then sold to Africa in exchange for African slaves. The slaves were then sent to America, and the cycle began all over again. This slide explains the story perhaps a little bit better. Each side contributed something to the overall system, but it's not an even system. Manufactured goods fetched the highest prices. Thus, Europeans reaped the biggest profit from the triangular trade. The trade also explains why Africans were so willing to participate in the enslavement of other Africans. They were getting something, manufactured goods, out of this trade. Now, to understand this further, we need to understand that this trade, the triangular trade, had an obvious impact on peoples around the globe. Now, the most obvious is the impact on enslaved Africans. Slavery contradicted the ideals of the Enlightenment, and that contradiction was not lost on many Enlightenment thinkers. Denis Diderot, the French philosophe who helped publish the Encyclopedia, was one who saw a contradiction between the Enlightenment's emphasis on liberty and human rights and African slavery. In 1772, he published a satirical critique of this contradiction in a book he called, quote, Supplement to Bougainville's Voyage, end quote. Bougainville was an actual French explorer who traveled across the Pacific and published his adventures in exotic places, like the island of Tahiti. Diderot decided that the native Tahitians deserved the chance to tell their side of the story, so he did so. Here is one passage from Diderot's book. Quote, Weep, wretched Tahitians, weep, but rather for the arrival than for the departure of these wicked and grasping men. The day will come when you will know them for what they are. Some day they will return, bearing in one hand that piece of wood you see suspended from this one's belt, and in the other the piece of steel that hangs at the side of his companion. They will load you with chains, slit your throats, and enslave you to their follies and vices. Some day you will be slaves to them. You will be as corrupt, as vile, as wretched as they are, end quote. Now let's break that down just a little bit. When he says, bearing in one hand that piece of wood you see suspended from this one's belt, I believe he's talking about the cross of Christianity. At the same time, Diderot is claiming that this cross of Christianity will be accompanied by a piece of steel, the sword, that will be used to enslave Tahitians and other native peoples around the world. Diderot was one guy, one man from the Enlightenment, who saw that the ideals of the Enlightenment were being betrayed by Western civilization and its embrace of slavery. The impact of Western civilization on the rest of the world was substantial. Some of that impact was unintentional. Europeans unknowingly spread diseases that killed tens of millions of native peoples. Other impacts continue to affect our world today. The Columbian Exchange introduced Western civilization to foods such as chocolate, vanilla, potatoes, tomatoes, just to name a few. Still, other impacts were highly negative. We have already discussed the cruelty of African slavery in earlier classes. That cruelty was not lost on all Europeans, as the words of Denis Diderot indicate. Still, the lesson to be learned here is that as Western civilization entered the modern age, its impact in the world was growing. We will continue to explore that impact in our next lesson.